Hello, everyone. My name is Lanso90, and welcome to another episode of Science Hour. So, our last Science Hour episode, we went over all the planets in the solar system. Uh, it took about exactly an hour to go over everything about each of the planets. So, this episode, I'm wanting to talk about the objects that we use to explore the solar system, satellites and space probes. This is going to be a history, so I'm going to start from the beginning and then I'm going to go on to modern times. But I'm not going to go over manned spaceflight, mainly because there are some excellent documentaries about that kind of thing, and those would be much more in depth than I could ever provide. And I feel that space probes are undervalued, so we're going to go over all the space probes. Uh, I will limit it to important space probes, the ones that performed first acts and things like that. We're not going to go over things where we sent like 10 or 20 different probes of the same type to do the same thing, because that happened a couple times, but we're not going to go over each and every one. And as always, like the last episode, I'm going to try to explain things in a simple manner, uh, not throw big numbers at you and stuff, so that it's easy to understand. Uh, I'm using Wikipedia. I know it's kind of uh, I don't know how to say it, just kind of frowned upon, I guess. But I couldn't really think of another way to show you guys what I'm talking about. I thought about using like the simulator that I used last time. It has a couple spacecraft, but it doesn't have everything. So I can't go into every satellite on those programs and show you what they looked like. I also thought of building them on Kerbal Space Program myself to build replicas, but there's too many and too many parts are too specific that I don't have them in Kerbal Space Program. So Wikipedia will have to do. So you'll see that we're on Sputnik. I'm sure most of you are probably familiar with this space probe, but it's actually a little bit untrue that it's the first thing in space. Uh, a V-2 rocket from Nazi Germany was actually the first thing in space. However, it was only a suborbital flight. That means it did not reach orbit. It got into space, but then it came back down. Another suborbital flight that happened before that was another V-2 rocket that was modified after the war by the United States. Then it actually carried fruit flies for an experiment. But Sputnik is the first satellite that went into full orbit and stayed there for a while. It didn't do much science, really. All it did was basically just prove a point. That's why it was sent up there. It did some research on atmospheric drag, and some radio signals revealed some information about the ionosphere. Other than that, it didn't do much actual science. It was just kind of a proof of concept and to kind of beat the US to the punch. Now, one cool thing I did find on this page for Sputnik is it actually has the sound file that it sent, the radio transmission that it sent. So I just want to show you guys that. Pretty cool. Sorry if that was too loud. But so let's move on from Sputnik. Oh, this was launched in October 1957. Just so you know what time period this was going on. Now, Sputnik 2 was the next thing that got put into orbit. And this is the famous because it brought the dog Laika inside of it. Uh, there's a misconception of some pictures. I don't think there's any displayed here, but some people think that there's pictures of Laika, and there actually isn't. That is from a different mission that actually came back with the dogs alive. Unfortunately, Laika died on this mission. She likely died of overheating. They didn't know that at the time, but they did have a system in place that would give it poisoned food. because they didn't expect that it would be able to survive re-entry. But apparently it didn't even get to that point. Beyond bringing the dog with it, it also performed a lot of science experiments as well. It brought back biological data from the dog, did some measurements on charged particles in the atmosphere, and did some things about the solar radiation and cosmic rays. This was launched in November 1957, so only a month or so from the last mission. And again, it's another Russian probe. Explorer 1 was the first U.S. satellite that was launched. It was launched in February 1958. It had some part failures while it was in orbit, so it didn't get as much science done as they were hoping. But it did confirm the existence of the Van Allen radiation belt, which is part of our magnetic sphere that we thought was there, but we couldn't prove it until this space probe proved it. You can see how different it looks from the Sputnik probe. This one's really long, whereas the Sputnik was round. Vanguard 1 was the next satellite the United States got into orbit. It was the first one that had solar panels on it, so it actually lasted quite a bit longer than the other ones. I forgot to mention it, but the other ones only lasted like a few days, maybe a month at most. But this one lasted like 2 months. No, 6 years. So it lasted way longer than all the other ones. And that's of course due to having solar panels. Additionally, it was interesting because it was the first one that they put into a high enough orbit that it still hasn't come down to this day. The previous satellites I mentioned burned up in the atmosphere by now, but this one is still out there. Sputnik 3 was, again, this one was from the Soviet Union. It was launched in May 1958. This one had quite a bit more science experiments on it. It analyzed the composition of the upper atmosphere, did more research into the charged particles, and also did detection of micrometeoroids. So this marks a transition between another generation of spacecraft, I would say. I'm kind of marking this myself. It's not like an official mark, but that's what I consider it to be. Keep in mind that there are more Earth orbiting satellites that are being launched as I go through the rest of these, but we're not going to go over them because they pretty much just build upon the same stuff. Nothing really new happened for the most part. So let's move on to Luna 1. Luna 1 was another Soviet Union spacecraft. It was launched in January 1959. It was the first spacecraft that fired a rocket while it was in orbit. All the other ones achieved orbit with their previous stages. But the rocket fired so that it could go towards the moon. It was meant to be a impactor for the moon. That means it's going to crash into the moon to gather some data. But it missed. But it wasn't completely fruitless because it missed, it ended up being the first probe to leave Earth's orbit. It started orbiting the sun rather than the Earth. It discovered solar wind. We didn't actually know that it existed until this probe found it. And also did some research on it while it could. And an interesting little secondary experiment that it released a kilogram of sodium gas into space to just gather some more data about how gases act in space. After that was Pioneer 4. It was a U.S. probe. It was launched in March 1959. It was meant to do a lunar flyby, but it missed. Same as Luna 1. It got close, but it didn't get close enough in order to activate its instruments. But so this became the second object to go into a heliocentric orbit. So now we move on to Luna 2. This was the first one that actually crashed into the moon like it was supposed to. Launched by the USSR again, September 1959. It actually has a kind of funny story. I'm not sure it's supposed to be funny, but I thought it was kind of ironic or kind of a dick move on Russia's part. But it had a bunch of not trinkets. What do they call them? Pennants on inside of it, so that when it crashed into the surface, it would leave these pennants on the surface, and it had the coat of arms of the Soviet Union on it and a bunch of Soviet inscriptions on it, just to show that they had been there first. And apparently the Russian premier sent the U.S. President Eisenhower at the time one of these pendants as a gift, but I kind of think it was just kind of to shove it in their face of, oh, look what we did. We got to the moon first. But I just thought that was pretty funny. Luna 3 was next. It was another Russian spacecraft, of course. October 1959. It sent back the first pictures of the far side of the moon. So it brought back the first picture of the far side of the moon. I think I have the picture here. It was extremely blurry and you can't really make much stuff out. But the main thing they noticed is that unlike the side that always faces the Earth, this side was very mountainous. You can see these black spots. That's like the large black spots that we have on the Earth-facing side. And it suggested that that's because that these spots were formed by magma. And it says here that they don't know why, but I'm fairly certain that it has to do with tidal gravitational forces. Because if you think of the moon, when it pulls on the Earth, it creates the tides. The water gets pulled up by the moon. I think vice versa, since magma is less dense than solid rock, that the magma got pulled towards the Earth. That's my guess. Pioneer 5 is a U.S. probe. It was launched in March 1960. It studied the solar radiation and cosmic rays and interplanetary magnetic fields. So this one was basically meant to just study the sun and the space in between the planets. You'll notice that, of course, it's Pioneer 5. Basically, the probes before that failed. You'll notice that throughout this, if we suddenly jump into a new series of spacecraft and it has a high number, all the failed spacecraft came before that one. I'm not going to go over all the failed spacecraft as well. I should have mentioned that at the beginning. Before we get to this one, I want to mention that between the Pioneer 5 and this craft, Yuri Gagarin became the first man in orbit. So that was in April 1961. And this space probe is Mariner 2, launched by the U.S. in 1962. Yes, December 1962. Oh, and I also should mention that the Cuban Missile Crisis occurred in October 1962, just for reference of what was happening historically at the same time. The 1960s were really a interesting decade. A lot of stuff was happening. But anyway, Mariner 2 was the first successful Venus flyby. A lot of spacecraft had been sent by both Russia and the US to the Venus. None of them had worked up until this one. Unfortunately, it didn't have a camera because they figured that Venus would be wouldn't have any details show up since it's shrouded in atmosphere. And if you look at Venus through a telescope, because I have my own little telescope on the ground here, there's actually, you can't see any detail on it. It's just bright and white. Though what is interesting is since it's an inner planet, it has phases like the moon does. It's not always full. In fact, for it to be full, it'd have to be on the other side of the sun, which means you wouldn't be able to see it. But it did detect the fact that Venus didn't have a temperature variance between the night side and day side. It also detected that it had little to no magnetic field, and that it rotated slowly and backwards. So even though it didn't have a camera, it still found out quite a few things about Venus. Before we move on to Mariner 4, I want to mention that the first EVA by Alexei Leonov was performed in March 1965 by the Russians, before this was launched, or before this reached its destination. This was the first spacecraft to reach Mars. It did the first successful Mars flyby, and took pictures of the surface. And those pictures actually changed how we thought about Mars. Before, we thought life on Mars was probably very likely. But once we got these pictures back, we saw all these craters and how there's like no water or anything. And we became very disassociated with the thought that there'd be life on Mars. Luna 9. Luna 9 was launched by the Soviet Union on it reached the moon in January 1966. I should mention that I'm going to start using the date of when things reached their destination, because once we get to interplanetary type stuff, it takes a lot longer for them to reach their destination, whereas when they're orbiting Earth or going to the moon, it only takes like a day. But anyway, Luna 9 performed the first soft landing on the moon. There had been many impactors to the moon by now that I didn't mention, because that would just be repeating the same kind of information, which you guys don't need to know. But yeah, it did the first soft landing, which means it just safely landed, and took pictures of the surface. And did I grab a picture? Oh, this is what it looks like when it landed. It popped open. This was what the spacecraft itself looked like. Don't see a link to the pictures it took, though. Oh well. Next is Luna 10. It was another USSR craft. It'll reach the moon in April 1966. It was the first orbiter of the moon. It did extensive research on the moon, magnetic field, radiation belts, cosmic radiation, micrometeors, and it also discovered mass concentrations, which basically means that there's a lot, and the moon's very interesting because some areas have a lot more gravity than other ones have, or relatively a lot more gravity than other areas have. And so this was the first spacecraft that detected that. Surveyor was the first U.S. thing to land safely on the moon. It landed in July 1966. It didn't really get anything different than the data that Luna 9 brought back, but I just wanted to mention that this was the U.S. equivalent that landed. You can actually see that we've later on we found it with a different moon orbiter. We figured out where it landed. Switching to NASA's official site, I couldn't really decide if I wanted to use Wikipedia or NASA's site. Wikipedia was like a little bit easier to navigate, while this one kind of gives a little bit more concise detail about what probes did what. But anyway, this was Lunar Orbiter 1. They weren't very creative with naming this one, but it was the first US orbiter around the moon. And it took the first picture of Earth as seen from the moon. Let's take a look at it at a closer look. See? So it's a view of Earth from the moon. It's a very cool picture. Okay, Venera 4, launched by the Russians, as evidenced by the interesting name. It reached Venus on October 1967. It was the first probe to actually enter Venus's atmosphere. It it stopped transmitting before it reached the actual surface, though. But if it got the first measurements that it was indeed extremely hot, and the atmosphere was way denser than they had thought. Okay, Mariner 5. Mariner 5 was a U.S. space probe, and it was launched in October 1967. It did a Venus flyby with better instruments than the previous craft had. And it arrived very shortly after the Venera probe did, so it was able to correlate the kind of science that it brought back with Venera's information. Now, here's something surprising about how fast things were advancing at this period of time. Between this and the next spacecraft, Apollo 11 happened, the first man landing on the moon. Yeah, there wasn't very many other interesting spacecraft in that time, other than all the manned missions and stuff going on, which I said you can always find out about those on a separate documentary or something. But that happened in July 1969. So Mariner 6 and Mariner 7, these kind of happened at the same time. Launched by the USA, July, and they reached their target in July and October of 1969. They did extensive mapping of Mars, and my notes here are a little bit off. But yeah, they did a lot more mapping of Mars than we had previously. Luna 16, very interesting little probe. This was a USSR probe, and it landed on the moon September 1970, and it did the first robotic sample return from the moon. Keep in mind that is the first robotic sample return because the Apollo 11 and 12 missions had already happened and they brought back stuff. After that, I'm actually missing one of my pages, so we'll just have to look at the picture for this one instead of the actual Wikipedia page. After that, they launched Lunikod 1. It was a Russian probe, November 1970. It was the first robotic rover on the moon, and generally just the first robotic rover. It's actually very large. It might be deceptive here, but it's like almost the size of the new rover that we put on Mars, Curiosity, which is huge. So after that, they had Venera 7. It was another Russian probe, December 1970, and it did the first relatively soft landing on Venus. The parachute didn't fully deploy as it should have, so it hit kind of hard, and it messed up the instruments a little bit. It barely got any data sent back home, but what it was able to send back home was the temperature, which was extremely high, 887 degrees Fahrenheit. Venus is not a fun place. Before we get to the space probe, I should mention that the first space station was put into orbit now, the Soyuz 1 Russian space station, April 1971. But this is Mariner 9, who was launched by the United States in November 1971. It was the first Mars orbiter, and it mapped 85% of Mars's surface, so completed the first really good map of Mars. And it did it with a resolution of around 1 kilometer of accuracy. Not very good by today's standards, but back then I could imagine that was a pretty awesome map for him to have. I'm sure it helped quite a bit in picking landing sites for the future landers. So now we're going to Mars 2. I should mention that the Soviets never had a very easy time of landing on Mars. They figured out how to land on Venus pretty well. We never could. But Mars, they just never had any luck. So all of these Soviet probes that go to Mars are only partial successes. So Mars 2 was launched by the Russians or reached Mars in November 1971. Brought an orbiter. The orbiter was successful, but the lander crash landed. However, you can say that it was somewhat successful, the lander, as just being the first impactor on Mars, although it was supposed to be a little rover. You can see it down here. I think they're called the Prop M. Mars 3 was a twin to Mars 2. This one kind of did the opposite thing of Mars 2 did. The orbital insertion didn't go quite as well as it's supposed to, so it had a really bad orbit. But the lander did successfully land, and it did deploy the rover. So it was the first successful soft landing on Mars and the first successful rover on Mars. But it only lasted for 20 seconds because, due to very unfortunate timing, the worst dust storm on Mars ever was happening right as it landed, and it short-circuited the rover. Venera 8. Venera 8 was launched by the Soviets, and it reached Venus in July 1972. It was a lot like the Venera 7 probe, but it was more successful because they built it to pretty much every time the Russians sent a probe to Venus, they just kept redesigning it until so it'd be more stable against the atmosphere and better suited for the heat. So this one actually landed on the surface for a good amount of time. Looks like about an hour, it's saying here. So that helped us get some more information. Now, to continue to put things into perspective, between this and the next probe, Apollo 17 landed on the moon, and that was the last moon landing there ever was for now. It happened in December 1972. So that quickly, all this stuff happened. It's amazing that we could get that much stuff done so quickly, because now we have to wait like decades for NASA to do something. Bring up the new page of pictures. Not the Voyager 2 yet. The Pioneer 10. Actually, you know what? I found out that I had these backwards. I think Pioneer 10. Yeah, Pioneer 10 was a little bit. No, Mariner 10 was first. Sorry, I figured that out after the fact, after I wrote it down. But I'm gonna say this marks another turning point on how we conducted our space exploration, because you'll notice everything up till now had just been direct missions to planets, a couple orbiters, but everything was just a one-shot thing. Mariner 10 did a lot of stuff. First, it did a Venus flyby, and it actually got this cool picture of Venus. And how it ended up seeing so much more detail was it took this picture with a ultraviolet camera, and I was able to find all this detail in the crowd cover, which before it just looked like solid white. But after that, let's see, I think it actually encountered a comet. I didn't write it down though. Um, yes. Uh, January 1974, Mariner 10 made ultraviolet observations of comet Kohutek. I'm not going to try to pronounce it correctly. So already it had performed like more stuff than any one space probe had done so far. But its real destination was Mercury, and it did 3 flybys of Mercury. One on March 1974, another on September 1974, and the final one on March 1975. And let's take a look at some of these pictures of Mercury. Not sure if all these pictures are by it. Maybe it was. Very cool pictures. So yeah, we can see that this probe did things a lot differently than anything else before it. It went to 2 planets, and even investigated a comet on the way. So very interesting. And that's a trend that starts to continue through these the rest of these probes. I'd almost say that this probe here, Pioneer 10, marks even another stage of development of even further like large-scale probes that did a lot of work. But Pioneer 10 was a United States probe. We're going to start seeing a lot less Soviet probes, by the way. It reached Jupiter in 1973. So this was the first mission to any outer planet, and of course the first one to Jupiter itself. Basically the Pioneer 10 and 11 probes, we'll get to 11 soon, were basically to pave the way for Voyager 1 and 2, because we didn't want to build a super expensive probe like the Voyager probes were, just to have them get destroyed in the asteroid belt or destroyed by radiation from Jupiter. So it discovered that the asteroid belt was very, very devoid of anything. The asteroid belts in Star Wars are very exaggerated. There is a lot of space between any couple asteroids. I actually thought it was interesting in the new Cosmos series that it portrayed the asteroid belt as being really dense. And, I thought they knew better than that, but no, it's not like that at all. But yeah, I've got the first pictures of Jupiter. You can see that unlike the other pages we've been looking at so far, that this one has like a lot more information. Just kind of furthering the point that the probes were getting really sophisticated by now. See, it has information about every little instrument that was on it. It is very fun to read, but I'm not going to go over all of it because it'd be boring. But here's a picture of Jupiter it took. The first close look at it. It also became the first probe that's on a interstellar course. It's the first one that had enough delta V to leave the solar system. But keep in mind, it's not the first one to actually leave the solar system. We'll get to that later. Venera 9 and 10, I'm going to consider these are pretty much twin probes. Both launched by Russia and reached Venus in October 1975. They consisted of both orbiters and landers, and they were the first real landers. Everything before this had just been like probes, and these were actually big old landers. You can see a picture of one here. Very big, very heavy, very Russian. But they got back the first pictures of. Did I not? Oh, here it is. Here's one of the first pictures it sent back. I think these have been updated recently. But yeah, they got back the first really good pictures of Venus and the best data and everything. Lasted about an hour each, I do believe. Venera 10 was just the probe was a twin to Venera 9. Pioneer 11 was a lot like the Pioneer 10, of course. They had like the same instruments and everything. You'll find that a lot of missions were sent out in pairs. And I guess that's basically just to prevent, well, if something goes wrong with one of them, then the other one can make up for it. That's a very long trend that I don't think has really ended until very recently. Just because our instruments are so much better that we can make a lot better guesses of, a lot better chances of things surviving. But Pioneer 11 was the second Jupiter flyby, but it was also the first to go to Saturn. And did I get a picture of? Yes, this is its picture of Saturn. And I think that's Titan in the background, judged by its orange color. Very cool. It's my favorite planet and my favorite moon. The Viking program. Gonna get into even more information now because the Viking landers were very high-profile missions. Launched by the United States, and they reached Mars between June and September. They came quite a bigger window than other spacecraft had before. And they launched their space probes not immediately when they got there. They launched them after, so they could take some pictures first and try to find the best landing location. But these were the first very successful Mars landers. The only ones that had come before it were the Russian landers, and we talked about those. They didn't last very long at all. But the Vikings were extremely, extremely successful. What? There's another picture I should open up. Oh no, it's gonna get rid of that tab. But this was the map that the Viking orbiters put together, and it's only been recently constructed completely. But it's a 4.25 gigapixel image of Mars, and you can just keep zooming in as much as you want. So if you want to, you can go to this website and explore Mars to your heart's content. Look how much we can zoom in. They're very, very awesome. Fortunately, keep in mind this is from the Viking spacecraft, so you're not going to be able to find the actual landers that have come before then, or since then. I don't think it has quite the resolution to find the Mars landers that were sent by Russia. But anyway, you guys should check that out. It's very cool. Here's what the lander itself looked like. I actually picked up a picture of Carl Sagan standing next to a replica of one. You can see they're actually very big. I used to think they weren't very big, but they actually are. Here's one of the famous pictures one of them sent back. They actually landed in very rocky terrain. If you notice the more recent probes we've sent to Mars, they've landed in pretty desolate areas. But wow, the Vikings really landed in some rocky areas. I think Viking 2, in fact, its area was so rocky that it had programming inside of it to burn into a different location if it was too rocky, and it had to do that. And they found it like a kilometer or so away from where it was supposed to be. But the only issue the Viking landers had was they were still designed as if finding life on Mars would be pretty easy, and they couldn't find anything. So they kind of didn't have the right science gear for the time, the best science gear they could have had. But they lasted a very long time, or at least one of them did. Uh, one of the orbiters lasted a year, or 2 years almost. The Viking 2. Then the Viking 2 lander lasted 3 years and a half. Viking 1 orbiter lasted 4 years. Viking 1 lander lasted 6 years. It's really cool. I didn't even know that they lasted that long. That's really cool. Yeah, these were very revolutionary. The picture quality was way, way better than anything we'd gotten previously. Revolutionized our understanding of Mars. Okay, so these are slightly different direction in the solar system. The Pioneer Venus orbiter was launched by the United States in December 1978. I should mention that it started getting cluttered on figuring out what had reached when. So some of this stuff might be a little bit out of order, but I tried my best. And I tried my best to grab the stuff that seemed interesting. But unfortunately, like everywhere I looked, uh, not every spacecraft is listed. They kind of pick and choose what they thought was cool and what isn't. So I tried to pick the most interesting spacecraft. But anyway, Pioneer Venus orbiter was the first U.S. orbiter around Venus. It performed a lot of detailed research around Venus. You can see all these different experiments it had on it. And another very nice picture. Then it was a twin, or sort of a twin, craft to the Pioneer Venus multiprobe. And this spacecraft launched one large probe and 3 small probes into the atmosphere. So it's like I don't know. I don't know how to describe what I was trying to say. It's the only thing that's launched more than one probe at a time, I do believe. Brought a lot of probes to Venus, which added quite a lot of information. The small probes all went to different locations: the north latitude one, a night side one, and a day side one. Okay. Okay, now we're getting into I keep saying this, but now we're getting into like very, very sophisticated space probes. So I actually stopped writing down the information for these just because there's too much to write down. And at this point, it's almost better for me to just read. But more or less, the next space probe to get anywhere interesting was Voyager 1. It reached Jupiter in March 1979. And let's take a look at some of the pictures it brought back. Of course, it has the golden record, which has information on like how to get to Earth, and everyone on Earth saying hello under different languages, and music by our best composers of all time. These are still both functional, by the way. I don't think anything else I've mentioned so far is still functional. But, yeah, these are the first things that I've mentioned so far that are still working to this day. You could see some stuff is being disabled on them, and other stuff isn't working anymore, but they are still transmitting back home. So let's take a look at the pictures they brought back. You can see the resolution on these is way better than anything we've seen before. It's approach to Jupiter. Some of these early pictures and footage, I don't know why, but they kind of feel eerie to me. Like these gas giants, they're a little bit creepy. I don't know why. But you can see these have really, really good picture quality compared to like the Mariner probes. Like I said, the Mariner probes were pretty much just junk probes to make sure that the way was safe. And then the expensive stuff was put onto the Voyager probes. A close-up look at Jupiter's moon Io. You'll remember from my previous video that Io has volcanic activity on it. Has very strange colorations and stuff too. You can see the actual eruption they found on it. And I think Voyager was the first one to discover that it was actually erupting. I don't think the Mariner probes found that out. It was also like the first one to get a good picture of Europa. Notice the cracks and how there's likely a liquid ocean underneath. Ganymede. We've also recently found out that Ganymede probably has a liquid ocean as well, just a lot deeper down, not as easy to access. After that, though, it moved on to Saturn. You can see the picture quality is quite a bit better than the Mariner Pro for this one, too. Of course, there's less detail on Saturn to look at, but moon Mimas. That looks like the Death Star. And it's very interesting actually that this moon was found after Star Wars was made, so it's not like George Lucas copied Mimas. I think I mentioned that in my last video. I'm probably repeating information, but I guess there's a chance you guys haven't seen my other video, so my favorite moon in the solar system, Titan. I do believe it was Voyager 1. It could have been Voyager 2, but I think Voyager 1, they had to make a decision to either do a close flyby of Titan or to send it off to Pluto. Which, no, I wasn't alive at the time or anything, but since I love Titan so much, I almost feel guilty that it didn't get to go to Pluto, because since the atmosphere is so thick, they couldn't really see anything anyway, so it probably would have been better off sending it to Pluto. But still, I love Titan. I'll probably have to devote a Science Hour episode just to Titan, even though I went over it in the previous one. This probe also took the famous family portrait of the solar system. Jupiter, Earth, the pale blue dot suspended in a sunbeam. Venus. Saturn. Everything is just little dots, how far away it is. Uranus. It's not even round for some reason. Neptune. Puts things in perspective. And now it is the first probe that reached interstellar space. It reached interstellar space in August 2012. Now Voyager 2 ended up going to a lot more places than Voyager 1 did. It went to all the outer planets, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune. Of course, it was posthumously, since at the time we believed Pluto was a planet. But now we know that it's been to all the outer planets. So we'll skip Venus and not Venus. We'll skip oh, this looks kind of interesting. I was gonna say we'll skip Jupiter and Saturn here, since we already went over them with Voyager 1. Looks like it got quite a bit better pictures of Saturn, though. Yeah, that looks a lot nicer than the Voyager 1 picture of Saturn. A lot more detail showed up. After the flyby of Saturn, the camera platform in Voyager 2 locked up briefly, putting plans to officially extend the mission to Uranus and Neptune in jeopardy. Fortunately, the mission's engineer was able to fix the problem. Very interesting. Like I said, I'm just skimming over this. We're already almost running out of time. There's a lot more spacecraft to go over, but trying to condense everything. Uranus, of course, Voyager 2 was the first and last probe to ever go to Uranus and Neptune. I don't think NASA has time his interest anytime soon to go to these planets. I think Uranus is sort of on their agenda, but not really, because when it first went to Uranus, there was no detail on it. See, it's perfectly one color. It's really crazy. But I guess now it's actually more active than it was back then. Again, I'm not going to talk about all the moons and stuff because I've done it before. And then it went to Neptune. Got our first and last up-close images of Neptune. I guess Neptune's done the opposite of Uranus now, and now Neptune is really low on activity. Okay, so last group of probes. Probably going to end up going over an hour, but I tried. Some of these spacecraft aren't too important, but Magellan, I'm never really sure how to say that name. Magellan, I think, was a large spacecraft that went to orbit Venus. You'll find that all of the planets kind of got their own heavy orbiter, and this was kind of the one that went to Venus. It went there in August 1990 and just did extensive mapping of Venus. I think it actually had a radar on it, so it was able to penetrate the atmosphere and make a complete map of Venus. Take a look at that. A very interesting place. I'd love to learn more about Venus. I don't think I mentioned it in my last video, because I didn't know at the time. But apparently scientists now think that Venus was like Earth at one point, like it had water and everything, just like we thought Mars did. So just think about that for a moment, that 3 planets in our solar system had water on them. Kind of makes the chances of life in the universe seem a lot higher, doesn't it? Next spacecraft. Again, this is another heavy orbiter for a planet. This was Galileo. It was good for Jupiter. Came in close, and it did all sorts of very in-depth pictures. You can see this false color image of is this Ganymede? I think it's Ganymede. It doesn't actually say. I believe it is, though. But very close-up pictures of Europa in very high definition. A thing worth noting, though, is Galileo actually had an issue. Its main antenna didn't deploy all the way. It was like a large fold-out antenna. You'll actually see a lot of like artist renditions of it with the antenna not fully deployed. So it actually had some trouble sending its information back. But it also brought along with it a space probe to send into Jupiter's atmosphere. Galileo probe. Brought back all sorts of very interesting data. Oh, and it also did a flyby of a couple asteroids in the asteroid belt on its way there. Oh, here's the thing about the main antenna failure. So you'll notice that no NASA space probes have fold-out antennas anymore. Mars Pathfinder was the first U.S. rover on Mars. I think it landed pretty close to one of the Viking landers, actually. Viking 2, I believe. But landed with airbags and deployed out like some of the other landers have. With, the lander itself actually had a camera to take a picture of the rover going up to a rock. Very cool. You'll see this area is very rocky too. And I should mention that there's a game I'm going to do Let's Play series on called Take on Mars. I've been trying to figure out how to do it properly because there's a lot of just long periods of just driving. But it's a Mars rover simulator, so it's very interesting. Very cool. And I will get to it. It's just going to take a little bit. Mars Global Surveyor is one of many orbiters we've sent to Mars. A lot of them failed. This one, I'm only showing the ones that didn't fail, though. But I think this lasted a very long time. Start of mission, 1996. End of mission, 2006. It lasted a very long time. Lots and lots of pictures. Sorry that I'm not getting into as much detail on them anymore, but there's quite a few spacecraft left, and we're almost out of time. 2001 Mars Odyssey. Again, it's just a lot like the Mars Surveyor. Lots of informations. Oh, look, they actually took pictures of each other. That's cool. I didn't know that. Mars Express, again, another Mars orbiter. This one, though, it dropped a lander called Beagle 2, but it didn't make it to the surface. It crashed. Or actually, I think it lost contact, so there's like a chance that it's on the ground working right now, but no one can get the contact with it. Okay, these are the ones that I actually start. I was aware when these stuff landed. This is the Spirit rover. It was the twin to Opportunity. It's unfortunately broken down since then. It's unfortunate, but brought back lots of really cool pictures. Okay, that's not loading for some reason. It's probably too big. You'll see that the place that they landed it in was a lot less rocky than the previous landings. Opportunity. This is the little rover that could. It's still operating to this day. And I don't know if the picture will be here. You can see it landed in a pretty flat area as well. Different kinds of rock, though. It found these blueberries, which is like some evidence that waters existed on Mars. Newberries, they found this more recently. It's not the same as the blueberries, but again, I think it's more evidence of water. Oh, they don't have the picture. Well, recently the probe was like all but completely covered over with dust, and like a few weeks ago, maybe It was very, very recently. A bunch of wind happened and it blew off all the dust, and it's getting as much power as it did like in its first days there. So it's probably going to last a lot longer. Okay, here's my favorite spacecraft though, the Cassini-Huygens probe. This was the large orbiter for Saturn, and it's still operating today. It's going into its final phase right now though. But you can see it's done like a full radar mapping of Titan. I love Titan. I'm gonna have to do a full thing of just about Titan. I'm sorry, it's a very cool place. Very, very high resolution pictures of all the moons and Saturn. It's a very awesome spacecraft, and actually, from what I've heard, it's actually huge. It's like the size of a bus. It's freaking huge. And it brought a lander along with it for Titan called Huygens. And that's the picture it brought back. I could go on for days about Titan. That's gonna have to make a different video just for Titan. But you can see all these cool pictures of all the moons. Let's move on. Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter. Yet another Mars orbiter. MRO, as it's called. Here's the most recent picture of the face on Mars. Doesn't look as much like a face anymore now, does it? Size comparison of MRO with its predecessors. Gigantic. Sometimes you underestimate how gigantic probes are, but even the smallest one here is the size of a person. Venus Express is a small little orbiter for Venus because, what was the name of the other probe we were just looking at that went to Venus? Magellan. Magellan is no longer in service, so this kind of took over. Phoenix lander. I also remember when this one happened. It landed in the northern polar region, I think, and was just doing some research about water and chances for life. It didn't last very long, though. It was only active for like a few months, and I think it actually wasn't all that successful, if I recall. Like, it's having trouble scooping up stuff. Very flat area it landed on. Messenger is our first like dedicated probe for Mercury. I think it's actually done like 100% mapping at high resolution of Mercury already. Ugh, some of these pictures are gigantic. Like I said, very high resolution. But it's still in service and still exploring. I did a flyby of Venus to get to there. And Mars Science Laboratory. The newest Curiosity rover on Mars. Very large. It's like the size of a SUV. But I'm sure most of you were familiar with this one, since it's so recent and it's very high profile. But it did the unusual landing of coming in with a parachute and then getting lowered on a wire and then using jets to land. Only way you could land something that big on Mars. But you'll see that it's like the first thing that we haven't launched in a pair to Mars other than Pathfinder. But it's just because we have so much more faith in our technology now, I think. If we thought everything so far had very high resolution, just take a look at this. Anyway, that's all the time we have for this science hour. I'm sorry I couldn't get into more detail about all of these things, but there was a lot to cover, and I could probably do 2 videos on it. But I probably will do specific videos for like the Cassini orbiter since I love Saturn and Titan so much. But I hope you all enjoyed and have a good day.